Henrik Ibsen was born on March 20th, 1828 in Skien, Norway. He was the oldest of 5 children. His father was a merchant while his mother painted, played piano, and enjoyed going to the theater. His family became very poor when Henrik was 8. They had to sell all of their nice possessions and try and get out of debt. The family then moved to a poor farm by his hometown. This is when Ibsen spent most of his time reading, painting, and performing magic tricks. When Ibsen was 15, he stopped school to work as an apprentice in an apothecary. In 1849, he wrote his first play, Catalina. He moved to Italy and Germany and then headed back to Norway, all while writing plays. His wife was Susanna Ibsen. She died in 1906. Ibsen had one son, Sigurd Ibsen, with Susanna, while he also financially supported a son from an earlier relationship whom he had never met. Ibsen died May 28, 1906. He was 78 in Oslo, Norway. His last words were to the contrary.
The year 1814 was an important year in Norwegian history. Norway drafted its own constitution on May 17th of that year. Many wars took place in Europe in the early 1800s. This included a war between England and France. Norway took France's side, but they lost. During the 19th century, a movement called National Romanticism took place. This movement was expressed in literature, visual art, and music. This was when the Norwegian people developed a sense of pride for their country.
Norway concentrated on developing natural resources. This industry established railways and the Gotha Canal, which enabled sea-going ships to cross the peninsula. The Norway king lived in Sweden but ruled Norway. During the 1890s, Norwegian demanded for equal representation and democracy arose into a campaign for a separate Norwegian consul service. This broke the union between Sweden and Norway. After this, Oscar II became the King of Norway.
Fashion in 19th century Norway was very unique. Brides at this time wore big elaborate hats with jewelry hanging from them in bright color. They wore dresses that had long skirts and came in at the waist that covered their shoulders, also with a white blouse under and something covering their heads like a hat or a scarf. 90% of the population were fishers and farmers in the 19th century in Norway. The population grew rapidly during this time period. There were a large group of people that immigrated to the U.S. from Norway. 1,900 people were employed at the fish canning industry in Norway. The Norwegian flag is red with 2 blue stripes, horizontal and vertical, with white outlining.
Theatrical realism was a general movement in 19th century theater from the time period of 1870 to 1960. This began as an experiment to make theater more useful to society and to develop a set of dramatic and theatrical conventions in hopes of bringing a greater real-life feel to performances. In the 18th century, David Garrick initiated the use of historically accurate costumes and sets to move away from melodrama and dialogue. By the mid-19th century, realistic gas lamps and fires had exposed the unnatural appearance of canvas backdrops and realistic box sets that were now 3 walls and furnished. This movement revolutionized contemporary theater in every aspect, from scenery, styles of acting, dialogue, and makeup. Auguste Comte, Charles Darwin, and Karl Marx were 3 men who developed ideas that led theater to realism. Comte developed the theory of positivity. Darwin suggested that people are controlled by the environment, behavior was beyond a man's control, and humanity is a natural object. Marx, on the other hand, proposed a political philosophy arguing against urbanization. Another well-known man was Richard Wagner, who helped lead the way for realism by creating one of the first realistic play scenes. His attempts at illusionism helped gain public acceptance for realism. Alexander Dumas, Emily Aguiar, George Bernard Shaw, Anton Chvosek, and Henrik Ibsen were some of the first writers to use realistic drama in their plays by showing the role of women, war, and business. Realism came about partly as a response to the new social or artistic conditions and is still used today.
The play A Doll House is set in the 19th century in Scandinavia and explores the unequal gender roles of the time. During this time period, women were treated poorly as they were beneath men. Married and unmarried women had different expectations. Unmarried women got money from their fathers, were not expected to work at home, and were under the control of their fathers until he died or they were married. Once married, women moved out and were now under the control of her husband. The roles of women mainly consisted of cleaning, cooking, and caring for her children in the house and her husband. Some women were allowed to work, but they had to keep it to the minimum because an employed woman meant they had a little bit of power. Not until the late 19th century were women given some rights, such as getting a higher education. Throughout this time period, women were trying to stand up to have their own voice. However, men at this time had the say-so as to what happened. They were the leader of the house, were involved in politics or financial issues, and had ownership over the woman and all her possessions. Women were taught to listen to anything that the man said, and the children were often taught to be seen and not heard. Although divorce was legal, it was uncommon because of its expense, difficulty, and because a woman would not be allowed to take anything and must become completely independent. Throughout the 19th century, women were subservient to men. They had limitations on education, voting, inheritance, and many other rights. Women relied on men their entire lives and did what they expected of them.